me start with a question about the communique, because you highlighted it on the language on WTO reform and the agreement that the system is not performing as intended and reform is necessary. Yesterday, the EU presented a proposal in Geneva, a fairly detailed proposal with its ideas for reform. And our ambassador there, Ambassador Shea, said in some areas it didn't go far enough, in other areas it was actually counterproductive, not the direction the U.S. wanted to go. Is the U.S. right now, is the administration, are you working on a proposal for WTO reform? And can you give us some kind of timeline for when that might be presented?
Yeah, so, do I have a microphone?
Thanks, it's low. Thanks for the question. Look, I think when we're talking about W reform, I think the important thing to keep in mind is how far we've come. And I want to start out by saying I think it's fantastic that countries are putting forward reform proposals. And that is a step forward. When I was in Geneva for about 3 years with a lot of the folks that are in this room here. And during that time, countries like the EU weren't even engaging in these issues. I mean, their response to this was that we don't need to reform the WTO. Everything's working just fine. And so the fact that they are now putting things on the table and recognize that there is a problem, I think is a great step forward. And I want to compliment the European Union and the member states for that shift in their position. At the same time, I think Ambassador Shea gave a fairly long intervention describing the U.S. position and why we felt that proposals that have been tabled aren't sufficient. I don't need to repeat that today. I'd encourage all of you to look at his remarks. But I do think it's important that people are coming forward. From the U.S., I'm not going to get ahead of USTR on the timing or what's going on there with respect to a proposal. All I'd say is I think the U.S. for years has gotten into the details of the problems that we see with the system. I elaborated on a few of them this morning. I think if you look at the monitoring function, it's coming up short. If you look at the negotiations, they're coming up short. And when it comes to dispute settlement, there are substantive problems and there are procedural ones. And we're going to continue to make those points and hopefully create an environment where everyone is talking about a positive way forward.
Let me shift to China. Help us understand what a successful agreement looks like here. Is it a bilateral agreement where both sides sign on? Is it a series of commitments by China to make certain changes? And if it's the latter, how do you see enforcement working? It's an unusual situation. We're not negotiating a trade agreement. We know what that looks like. This is something different. So what does the endpoint look like, and what are the benchmarks to measure progress along the way?
So the endpoint is the implementation of structural changes that address the concerns that we've raised. And I think it's one of those things where we're going to have to monitor progress, and we're going to have to make sure that there's actual follow-through. I think our critique of past administrations is a valid one, and that's that there have been commitments that have been made that weren't actually implemented. And so the only way we're actually going to get to success is when that implementation occurs. And in terms of the substance of what that agreement would need to entail, or what that implementation would need to entail, is structural. And I elaborated on a couple of the specific things that we need them to do. There are more, but that is where I would focus. Now, how do you track that along the way? Well, I think, as I mentioned, let's focus on actions. And I think that we hope to see positive things coming out of China in the weeks and months ahead. And ultimately, then, we hope that the real structural things start to get addressed. So I know I'm not being incredibly specific, and of course, it may not be helpful for me to elaborate in public on all of the benchmarks that we have for the negotiations, but I think it's important that China realize, and everyone in this room realize, two things. It needs to be structural, and it actually needs to be implemented, not merely committed.
Well, to me, that is significant, your emphasis on implementation, because the agenda in the White House statement, tech transfers, subsidies, SOEs, market access, is very ambitious, and success requires implementation of reforms to achieve those goals, and that has to be done by March 1st?
So I don't want to focus on the timeline for this. I think as the president was clear, he expects there to be action on U.S. concerns by the 90-day period, and that is the operation, or that is the assumption we're operating under.
And in addition to the trade conversation, these difficult issues, you now have another set of issues that it's a little unclear whether they're part of the negotiation or not, and that involves the criminal prosecutions, including the detainment of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei CFO, other prosecutions, the efforts by the U.S. to keep Chinese telecom equipment out of our system and the system of our allies. Tell me about the effect of these measures on the trade discussion, and in fact, whether they are part of what could be in a final agreement.
So I'm not going to speculate on the terms of any final agreement, because as I mentioned, I think that is a subject of the negotiations. I do think, though, that a legal proceeding needs to be taken on its merits. And these decisions are largely that you're talking about are legal proceedings, and I think there are legitimate reasons for the U.S. to take certain actions, and we're going to continue to take certain actions where appropriate in accordance with our law. And that's what we do. We are a law and order society, and we are going to address issues across a range of areas when appropriate. And I would just hesitate to try to relate every single action or every single statement between the U.S. and China as somehow being linked to the negotiations. Because between now and March 1, I can promise you, there's going to be a lot that happens between the U.S. and China. We are interacting with each other on a routine basis across a range of areas. And that includes economic issues, it includes issues outside the economic space when you get to security and other things. And the conversation in Argentina as well wasn't only trade issues. So we're going to need to be in a situation where we can continue to engage with China across a whole range of fronts. Some actions, may be perceived by the outside world as positive, some may be perceived as negative, but I would just hesitate to try to draw conclusions about the impact on the negotiations of every single announcement between now and March 1.
On USMCA, you made a very strong case. You didn't mention the threat of withdrawal, which has kind of been a prospect from the beginning of President Trump's term. Certainly, I think you could argue that threat had some leverage effects in the negotiation with Mexico and Canada. But now that we have a signed agreement and an election that put the Democrats in the majority in the House, do you think the threat of withdrawal or actual withdrawal from the existing NAFTA is helpful to get that through Congress?
That's up to the president, and it's the president's decision on how he wants to proceed ultimately. What I would say, though, is that I'm very optimistic about the chances of the agreement in any scenario. And the reason for that is what I elaborated on earlier, which is if you're a Republican, there are great provisions in there for you. Things that Republicans on the Hill are consistently talking about: IP protection, digital trade. Those things are robust, novel, and stronger than any other agreement we've had. If you're a Democrat, labor, environment, currency, it's all there, and it's enforceable. And if that's what you believe in, there's a lot for you to like, and there's a lot that you should vote for. And so ultimately, I think we're going to spend a lot of time in the next couple months talking about this statement, that statement, this action, that action. But at its core, this is a strong agreement that should get bipartisan support. And again, a lot of credit goes to Ambassador Lighthizer for this, is that he wasn't afraid to take on all these issues that have been raised for years and try to forge a new bipartisan consensus. But I want to actually elaborate on this a little bit more, because I think it's important. I think that historically, as long as I've been working in trade, it's often come down to a partisan issue. And most of the trade agreements we've passed have been largely supported by Republican votes. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think that you see across the country a lot of discontent with the current rules of trade and the trading system and our trade agreements. And the only way that we are going to fix this and get broad support from the American people is if we do so in a bipartisan fashion. And so I think it's great that we now have a situation where we have an agreement with bipartisan provisions and that we're going to pass in a divided Congress with bipartisan support. I hope for all of you in this room, and I know most of you in the room are huge supporters of trade, for those of you who support trade, pulling this off will be great for the long term and in finding a way forward where we can do more agreements that have more support from the American people.
Let me just end on the G20, because for all that you've come through, you've got to get started again quickly, because Japan chairs the 2019 and they're holding the summit in June. So a very compressed schedule. You mentioned WTO reform and a couple of other issues as being key victories in Argentina. What do you see in working with the Japanese in their G20 year?
Well, we're really excited to work with the Japanese. I think that Japan and the United States have a lot in common. We have a lot of mutual interests, and they've been a great partner to us across a whole range of areas. Japan has been a leader, like the United States, in calls for reform of the WTO. So obviously that's going to be a topic of conversation. Another area I think that Japan is intending to make one of the pillars of their G20 host year is quality infrastructure. And that gets into the issues that I mentioned in the communique about the importance of doing infrastructure financing and development financing on transparent terms that doesn't lead to unsustainable levels of debt. And so I hope that we can really build on that and get an international consensus on principles, strong principles that we should all adhere to. That's going to be a key area. Japan is also a leader on some of the women's economic empowerment issues and some of the workforce development issues, talking about how to harness new technologies, artificial intelligence and other things, and how to take advantage of these technologies to build a better future for our people. You know, there's a lot of conversation in Argentina, and the original drafts of the communique, I would say, were quite negative. And they were talking about the challenges of technology and how we need to ensure that technology doesn't hurt people. And certainly you need to protect against that, but I think the U.S. view, and this is consistent with the way we've always approached things, is much more positive and forward-leaning. It's how do we take advantage of technology? How do we use this to raise people out of poverty, give them new opportunities? And so that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to engaging with them during the upcoming year.
Let's go to questions from the audience. If you would please state your name and your affiliation.
Hi, Brian Bradley from American Shipper. Thanks for taking my question. I'm wondering what specific signals or indications you're looking for from the Chinese side before you claim victory or say we've reached a destination here. Are you looking for them to pass legislation that would bring about the structural changes you're looking for some sort of official treaty? Can you sort of elaborate in that respect?
Yeah, sure. Excuse me. Well, look, it can be done in a lot of different ways, and I don't want to prejudge how things evolve, and I don't want to prejudge what success could look like. But again, I would come back to what I said. I think in the short term, actions are important. And seeing China follow through on some of the things that were discussed in Argentina, I think will send a very positive signal. I think you're starting to see some stuff coming out of China. We hope that that continues. I think over the longer term and leading into March 1, it's critical that the structural issues start to be addressed in a meaningful way. And at the end of the day, I'm going to keep coming back to that because that's what this is about. This all started with a Section 301 investigation into forced technology transfer and other structural issues in China, and that's what we need to see. And those are the signals we're looking for.
Katie Holson with the Chamber of Commerce. You mentioned the G20's inclusion of women empowerment as a priority initiative. Taking aside the civil rights undertones of that, do you see any substantial impact on the private sector in that regard, or any ways, any other externalities of that?
Of course, there was a lot of discussion about this actually, and from the U.S. perspective and the way that our economy works, it's obviously critical that the private sector be engaged in this and that the private sector start to adopt policies that provide women with greater opportunity within their companies. Now, certainly there can be a governmental role, and there's certain legislative initiatives that we may be interested in, but we pushed very hard to make sure that the discussion in Argentina and that the language in the communique reflected the role of the private sector. Because in the United States, as all of you know, we prefer not to tell our companies what to do. We think that we're a more successful and more vibrant economy when the private sector takes initiative on its own, and so I think that's what we were trying to encourage. And I'm excited about some of the upcoming announcements that we're going to have there, and I think all of you should be looking forward to Assistant to the President Ivanka Trump's event in January.
Let's go to Doug right here.
Hi, Doug Palmer with Politico. Thanks, Clete, for doing this. I just wondered, what is the U.S. expectation regarding the Made in China 2025 program? Are you asking for them to dismantle that, reform that, not have a development program in terms of these high-tech industries? And then just if I could seek a second question, President Trump tweeted again this morning that NAFTA is going, or USMCA is going to pay for the wall. Is there any provision in the new agreement that requires Mexico to pay for the wall? In what sense could Mexico be paying for the wall as a result of the USMCA?
Well, I'm not an immigration expert, so I don't think I'm gonna weigh in on that issue. But I'll take the first one, and obviously Made in China 2025 is a program that we've been concerned about for a long time. And it's clear that China has had a directive from the top levels of their government about how to create what some people call national champions, but what I call global champions, in a range of high-tech strategic sectors. And they're doing taking a range of activities, industrial subsidies, discriminating against foreign companies, local content requirements, you name it. And the directed acquisition of sensitive technologies. And so we are taking head on those specific elements of it. What the nomenclature is I think less important than the actions themselves. And so, I've seen, just like you have, some news stories in recent days about what China may or may not do with that. I think it's, again, important not to look at what they say about Made in China 2025, but we need to look at whether those policies actually change. And the focus of our conversation is on many of those underlying policies.
Thanks. Thanks for a very thorough presentation, Clete. Jim Fothery with GR Group Asia. As if doing the China negotiation, getting the USMCA through Congress is not challenge enough, you are also on the hook to start negotiations with Japan on a U.S.-Japan trade agreement. Now, I don't want to get into all the weeds about the Japanese calling it the tag and so forth. It's a comprehensive agreement, but my question really goes to what are your expectations in terms of the timing, the scope, and I would underscore just the need to really use this opportunity to make it not only about agriculture and autos, which are critical, but also about the things that we're really good at, like life sciences, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, digital economy. This is a really great opportunity to push those issues in this negotiation, not only to get more market access in Japan, but to set higher standards in reference to the USMCA, which you mentioned. And I don't mean to editorialize, but it is a really good opportunity
No, I appreciate the comment, I really do, and we're really excited about those negotiations. I think this is a huge market for us, and we are really looking forward to opening up that market in a comprehensive way. And I think that, right now we're obviously in the TPA waiting period, as it were, and so negotiations have not yet commenced. But I'm optimistic that we can move forward pretty quickly, and that we can do so across a whole range of sectors, many of which you've mentioned in your remarks. I do think that the U.S. and Japan, as I mentioned, have a ton in common, and I think we can really have a great gold standard agreement with them as well. And I think we're focused on the issues you raised.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Salo with Schneider Electric, and thank you for all of this. I want to just applaud you for the USMCA agreement. We're huge fans of the Digital Trade Chapter, and it's really important, and we will be vocally supportive of that. But can you say a little bit more about what you might be doing on digital trade through the WTO or through the Plurilateral Initiative, or if you're going to be looking to replicate that chapter in other new trade agreements?
No, thank you for the question, and thank you for your support. We really do appreciate it, and we think that this is an agreement that has hit the mark on a whole range of sectors. And so for those folks in the business community in here, if you like the agreement, let us hear about it. And I encourage you to all be out there and giving us the positive feedback, and giving the USTR the positive feedback that I think it deserves. Obviously, on digital trade, this is an area that's critical to the long-term strength of our economy. This is an area where we have, I think, a very strong competitive advantage. We are very proud, and we think we got great provisions in the USMCA, and we're going to look to replicate that wherever we can. I don't want to get into, in this agreement we're going to do this, and in the WTO we're going to do that. But what I would say is I think what you see there is groundbreaking, and it's the kind of thing that we're going to continue to push for in every fora that we can.
Let's just get one other big issue on the table, and that's the bilateral negotiation with the EU. Presidents Trump and Juncker agreed in July, joint statement indicating the trade negotiation would be about industrial goods except autos. The U.S. has since taken the position that it must include agriculture, the EU that it must not include agriculture. How do you square the circle?
So I think on that one, I would start with where we were on July 24th. And as many of you will recall, the expectations going into that meeting were pretty low. But we had a situation where there was, I think, good rapport again. Personal chemistry is important. I don't think that can be said enough. If you look throughout history, agreements are made between individuals, oftentimes, on behalf of their countries, but you need to have that dynamic. And you had a good relationship between President Juncker and President Trump, and you have very good relationships between many of the staff as well. And I know there's some European colleagues in the audience, and I want to say we have a great working relationship, and we appreciate the opportunity to work with you. Because much like Japan, I think we are basically market economies, we are democratic societies, and we need to work together. And we need to find a way. We have some differences, we always will. There are things about European policies, particularly in the agricultural space, that we don't think are entirely fair. But at the end of the day, we need to find a way to talk about our problems, to work through our problems, and move forward. And I think what you saw there was that recognition that we need to find a way to set aside differences and actually make progress on some of the issues that we hadn't made progress on before. And so we had that statement on July 25th. And since that time, we've been working furiously behind the scenes. USTR has been engaging with their counterparts at DG Trade on certain issues. Obviously, we need to respect the TPA, so we're not negotiating on some of those things in the statement quite yet. And so, you asked a question about tariffs, and we're not there yet. We respect the congressional prerogative on TPA, and so we haven't gone there yet, so I can't speak to that. But what I can speak is that we have been engaging on a range of standards issues, I think in a very robust and meaningful way, and there are things that we're talking about now that had not been on the table, or had not been, that we not positively addressed in TTIP, and I think we're making progress. There's also a broader issue of other actions that are being taken, and we're looking at LNG. The U.S., as I mentioned before, one of the keys for us to promote a vibrant energy sector. We want to help provide Europe with energy security, and we think that one way to do that is to significantly break down barriers to LNG trade between us. There's things we can do on a regulatory front. There's things that we can do commercially. We can create the conditions for our businesses to enter into projects. And then finally, I want to mention the trade irritants between us. I think there's been a lot of focus on some of the things that the U.S. is doing, or the U.S. is considering. At least the European Union has been very vocal about it. But I think it's also important to remember that we have some serious concerns as well. And these are things that go beyond the agricultural issues that I mentioned. And I think if you look at digital taxation, you look at some of the state aid decisions coming out of Europe, those are things that are a very serious concern to the President of the United States and for this entire administration. These are things that are a very serious concern for the business community. And we see these things as targeted really at the heart of America's innovative economy. And so we've made clear to the European Union that as we're waiting to get into the actual nuts and bolts of the FTA talks, and as they're raising with us some concerns that they have, they also need to be very mindful of the impact that those policies that they're doing can have on us. And so I would say the scope of these conversations ultimately will be about these core trade things. Right now, we're doing things we can do outside of TPA, but then there's a broader context here that's important, and that broader context gets into things like LNG, it gets into state aid, it gets into digital taxation. And so I hope across the board, we can have a positive solution for the American economy. Speaking of
Where we
European-
take two and then okay. Jean-Francois and next gentleman.
AFEP, a French group of major companies. I have two questions, maybe. The first one is WTO. On the one side, the US and a number of countries want to strengthen disciplines, particularly on developing countries or so-called developing countries. But then there is a feeling that the US wants to weaken the dispute settlement system. So strengthening on the one end, weakening on the other end, is there a contradiction? And the second question relates to China, and specifically subsidies and SOEs. What type of signals do you expect over a 3-month period for a substantial change in the structure of the Chinese economy? I remember that Ambassador Lighthizer is on record for saying that it would take years to change the structure of the Chinese economy. So what would you expect over a period of 3 months?
No, thanks for the questions. And I want to start by, again, being complimentary to the French government. I know you're not a part of the government anymore, but I was very heartened by the way that I was able to engage with my counterpart from France. I was very heartened also by comments by President Macron down in Buenos Aires. He talked very articulately about some of the types of practices that China engages in and the need to be able to address those. And he was very open to the need for reform. And so I think that's a very positive signal. In terms of your question, I think your first question, you talked about strengthening the rules and maybe a perception of weakening them at the same time. I think if you look at our concerns about the WTO, it's that countries aren't following the rules. And we need to do that better. We also need to address concerns with the dispute settlement system. We've been clear about that. And I think that if we can pick up momentum, we can find a way to do this in a coherent way, to make sure that we have a set of rules that countries follow and that have meaning But it's going to be a delicate balance in trying to figure out how to work all of these things into the equation. And so that is something that I would be hopeful we could do in a short order of time, but it is difficult, and we're going to have to confront all of the different elements of the WTO. On China, again, I think I've mentioned a couple times, I don't want to prejudge, where we're going to be on March 1. I don't want to prejudge what China can and cannot do. There are very serious structural issues that we need to see addressed, and we hope that they can address them quickly. Obviously, China's not going to have a market economy by March 1. And so I don't think anyone expects that every single problem we have with China is going to be dealt with by that time, and that probably would be a difficult expectation to meet. But there are certainly some things that they can do, we believe, to deal with some of the structural issues we've identified in a relatively short period of time.
Let's keep it very short.
Yes, now Baoyama from the Asahi Shimbun Japan's newspaper. Japan will serve as the chair of next year's G20, and I believe Japan should take over responsibility for keeping the momentum of WTO reform going. And Japan shares their U.S. concerns about China's trade practices, and it welcomes its ambitious goals of addressing them. But on the other hand, there is some confusion regarding the United States multilateral policy coordination, the withdrawal from the TPP, and the use of the steel and aluminum tariffs, and the threat of the auto tariffs against the U.S. key allies of Europe, Canada, and Japan, having confusing some Japanese, and many Japanese have been concerned that the U.S. might destabilize the underpinnings of the post-war international liberal order. Would you can I have?
No, it's a great question, actually, and I didn't get into this in my opening remarks, but this was a key focal point of the discussions down in Argentina, and there was a lot of debate about were we going to use the word multilateralism in the statement, and how were we going to use the word multilateralism in the statement. We ended up in the trade section recognizing that in the past, the multilateral trading system had benefits, which is unambiguously true, but that in the present state, it wasn't meeting its objectives. And I actually think that's a good reflection, a proxy for the U.S. view on multilateralism more generally. Multilateralism has been tremendously beneficial to this country, and I think that it can be in the future. But we all have to be realistic about the current state of play. And I've talked at length about the WTO, but you could talk about a lot of other international organizations and where they aren't meeting their objectives and where they're going beyond their mandate. And I think we have to be very careful about recognizing multilateralism for multilateralism's sake. We certainly want to work with each other to solve problems around the world, and that is an objective that the United States shares. But also, there are certain problems that call for different types of solutions. Sometimes you need to take tough unilateral action to start the conversation, to start change. Sometimes you get momentum by doing things in a bilateral or a plurilateral way, and we should be open to any of those alternatives. And I think that we have not turned our back on multilateralism. I think the fact that we were down at the G20, we negotiated a communique that literally every single paragraph talks about working at the WTO, working at the IMF, working at the World Bank. That shows the U.S. is still committed to the system, but because we believe in the importance of the system, we're the ones showing leadership and saying, if you want the system to work, you need to be realistic about its shortcomings, and you need to fix it before it's too late. And so I think that was a great question to end on, and it's a great segue into the G20 that's going to be held next summer in Japan. We're very much looking forward to Japan's host year. We think they're going to be a great host, and hopefully we can make progress on all the things that I talked about today. So thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to seeing you all around Washington.
Thank you, Clete. Thank you, Michael. Really terrific conversation. We're very grateful to you for joining us.
us today. Thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you at our Washington International Trade Conference on January 29th. Keep a watch in your inbox. We'll be announcing other upcoming 2019 events shortly. Thanks all.